convey to you the issues, so you can understand the issues, the environmental issues mostly, associated with this whole approval of the Maules Creek mine. Like, when you really understand the issues, then you really comprehend why people are putting their lives on the line. And it's not just being radical. There are very serious issues there that we need to be bringing to attention. So, why are people protesting about the mine? So that's the lay of the land, and so there's Leard State Forest. So over here we've got the Kelvin Range, the Nambua Range, and over here the Pilliga. So Leard State Forest is very significant from the point of view of the Liverpool Plains, which is all this area here. Is very much overcleared, so it's dominantly agriculture, and there's very little of it as a natural remnant. So this remnant here was really important from that point of view. There are other remnants around, but they're probably more ridge remnants and not as low as Leard. So it's very significant from that point of view. We'll go into all the other significance as we go through it. So there it is before mining. There it is. We're looking at sort of 21, 25 years down the track. Now, here, this end here is the Tarrawonga mine. This area in here is the Boggabri mine. And then north of this corridor is the Maules Creek mine. So this is an artist's impression of what it's going to look like down the track. It's actually a little bit worse than that, because Tarrawonga are going to include this area here, and the Boggabri mine actually comes out a little bit more than that. So yeah, we've got the three mines. The Tarrawonga is not chewing into the forest very much at all, but Boggabri is, of course, and Maules Creek is. Now this little line through the middle here, that's going to be a 500 metre wide corridor that's to enable the flora and fauna to disperse between this remnant that's left and this remnant here. There's lots of reasons why people are protesting, and yeah, we're just going to whiz through those very quickly. So the destruction of the forest to benefit the two mines, a public forest, and that really sticks with a lot of people. They just don't like the idea of a public forest being destroyed for the economic benefit of a mining company. So the impact of the community, like we've already talked about that this morning and seen on the video, how the community is really severely impacted. So there's that division of community, there's those for and against, the divided communities, and there's the dust and the noise and the light and the traffic that comes with it. There's the impact to the underground water table. A lot of the farmers in this area are concerned about whether or not their bores are going to have water down the track, or whether or not their bores are going to be polluted by that water. There's the impact, from my point of view, the impact to 30 threatened species and the critically endangered ecological community. In my mind, that hasn't been adequately assessed. So we've already talked a bit about the global impact, so the climate change impact of the mine, and the Gomeroi cultural heritage. That's a significant impact I'm not fully aware of, but certainly Gomeroi can tell you all about that. There's the failure of the planning process. So this is a major one. We've all been part of, since day one when the impact assessment was put out there for public exhibition, we've been part of the process from day one. We've made the submissions, we've turned up to the public hearings, we've done everything that we possibly could to be there, to have had input. And yet, all that input has been ignored. It's been tokenistic environmental concern. So the more we've been exposed to the process, the more we've realised just how much the whole thing was a done deal long before anyone in this area got to know anything about it. It was a done deal, and the consultation and the environmental considerations were tacked on after the deal was done. And there's this total focus on economic benefit. And then added to that, the government just hasn't acknowledged our concerns. We've repeatedly asked them to come out into the field to look at the issues with us and to show them, to put it in front of them, to show them that the vegetation is not like for like, that the habitat doesn't match up, and yet no one's bothered to come out and talk to us. So that makes the Maules Creek community very angry. They know that this whole process was based on false and misleading information that was put in the impact assessment. Those issues raised by the public's value on the forest, and that's what they came up with. So that's the critically endangered ecological community Maules Creek's going to clear. There's 544 hectares of it, and that's the area that Blockade is clearing. 624 hectares of critically endangered ecological community. That's the extent of the Box Gum Woodland in the Blockade area. The Blockade mine area, so all that yellow area was the critically endangered ecological community. That's the Blockade mine eating into the critically endangered ecological community with the forest in the background. Office of Environment and Heritage have come out with some really strong statements throughout this whole process, but it would seem that OEH have not really been listened to by New South Wales Planning. This was one of their earlier statements that they came out with, where they said that Leard State Forest had irreplaceable, ecologically unique values, including the highest quality remnant patch of grassy box woodland on the heavily cleared Liverpool Plains. And they went on to say that it has exceptional ecological value. And they also identified a point that we picked up on as well, that the impact assessment was based purely on the actual cleared footprint of the mines, when in actual fact the impact is much greater, as the impacts of noise, of vehicles, dust, light at night is going to impact on a much larger area of the forest. And they were saying that it could impact on as much as 60% of the forest, which was quite correct. And then down the bottom there, that last bit down here, they say that it's not acceptable for the proponent to offer an offset that's inadequately detailed, includes a high proportion of restoration works, and has not been properly assessed or justified. Unfortunately, planning didn't listen to the other New South Wales department. So these are the threatened species that occur in the forest. A lot of these birds are woodland birds that occurred extensively up and down the western slopes of the Great Dividing Range and the Box Woodlands. So most of the threatened species associated with the forest are those that have been listed because that was their preferred habitat. So that the Box Woodlands that extended all the way from the Queensland border to the Victorian border have been largely over-cleared, and that's why they're vulnerable. So remnants like this out here at Leard State Forest are really important for the conservation of those species. As well as the birds, we've got quite a few bats, quite a few cave bats, which is interesting. We've not actually found where they're actually coming from, but somewhere in the proximity of the forest there must be sandstone escarpments, overhangs, caves where they're occurring. And the other bats, the little pied bat and the yellow-bellied sheath-tailed bat and Cor's long-eared bat, they're hollow-dependent species, so they need those hollows. And the reason that they're there is because there's lots of hollows in the forest, and they're in very, very high numbers, both the hollows and the bats. I've done a lot of bat work throughout the northwest and tablelands and the coast too, for that matter, and I've never seen any other remnant where you'll get the same diversity and abundance of bats as you do in Leard State Forest. So bats have sort of become a bit of the theme for this campaign now. Whenever you see any posters and everything put up, and there's often bats on it, because bats have sort of been the link that people have been able to comprehend the diversity and how special the forest is for our fauna. So as well as that, we've got squirrel glider, quail and pale-headed snake. The pale-headed snake wasn't considered whatsoever in the impact assessments, a species that we recorded more recently. Toloptera linearis, that plant wasn't recorded in the impact assessment either. There was another one that we raised attention about, which has not been adequately considered. There's no offsets proposed for it. And these are migratory species over here, Satin flycatcher, white-throated lead-tailed rainbow bead, and these three down here, the forest is suitable habitat for those species. They're not actually being recorded, the region honey-eater swift parrot and spotted-tailed quail, but they could likely occur. So there's some photos of the threatened fauna. That's not all of them, it's just some of them. That's a poster on the wall over there, the same one. And the significance of the forest is not just its threatened fauna, it has an amazing diversity of all fauna. I did a bit of a quick count up last night. I think there's about 240, 250 fauna species, native fauna species that occur in the forest. There's about 160 species of birds, there's about 41 species of reptiles, there's about 14 or 15 species of frogs, there's about 26, 28 species of mammals. So it is incredibly diverse, and to say that it doesn't have high conservation value is just ignoring all that. So yeah, there's some amazing critters in the forest. You can see the bandy there, the coral snake there, and Burton's legless lizard over there, and some of the interesting frogs. We've got tree frogs, we've got burrowing frogs. Yeah, it's just amazing the diversity of all those different niches, all those different habitats. We've got small mammals like the Elephantodontichinus and the common dunnard over there. They're the little marsupial guys that run around. Up in the trees we've got feather-tailed gliders, Gould's long-eared bat, sugar glider, brush-tailed possums of course, and the incredible diversity of bats. Like I said, there's 16 species that occur in the forest. I don't know of anywhere that has that same diversity of species of bats. So, why should the mines not have been approved? Well, like I said before, that the impact assessments weren't, impact to the forest wasn't properly considered. So all those impacts of noise, dust and vehicles and the night light. So you visualise, like I've been above the Boggabri mine area at night in that escarpment, and the noise that comes out of that mine, the light that comes out of that mine goes right to the top of that ridge, and that must have a big impact. The lowering of the water tables wasn't fully considered, so a lot of that edge vegetation or those huge holes that are going to be left in the ground is going to lower the water tables and going to impact on the vegetation, particularly that 500 metre wide corridor that separates the two mines. Large area of the offsets, as I said, is not the endangered ecological community as claimed. Majority of the offsets are not the same threatened species habitats claimed. A lot of the impact assessment that I read, it was a bit like a fairy tale in lots of ways. Like it was written by people who don't know the fauna of the area, who aren't familiar with the fauna of the area, and yet their opinions has been taken as gospel over ours, over mine in particular. Conservation agreements are going to be put on the offset properties in the long run. Those conservation agreements virtually provide no long-term assurance whatsoever. So we're giving up a forest, living in the hope that we will get someday we'll get some compensation. But within the life of the mine, 25 years or whatever, after that there's going to be no ongoing management of those areas. So the ecological community will decline, state and national threatened species will decline, and most importantly, this whole issue sets a terrible precedence for other mine proposals, and it's more than likely that as we've seen in the Hunter Valley, where there's extensions, once leases are granted, they'll want extensions into the forest. So how did they get it approved? Well, like I said, they've purchased these offset properties, which are supposedly to be managed for conservation. A lot of them they've located them in positions where they're hoping that national parks will take them over and will provide some sort of ongoing management, conservation management for them. But yeah, that's only a wish at this point in time. They propose to regenerate habitats on those properties, so by changing the management of them from the point of view of grazing, etc., they're hoping that the habitats on those properties will regenerate. They've got areas that they're planting corridors of trees to link remnants. They're going to rehabilitation the mine overburden area, and the regeneration of grazing and cropping paddocks, like I said. And they're going to use a lot of the artificial habitats. So a lot of the logs and hollows that came out of the initial clearing, they're going to put back into those regeneration areas. But the $6 million question is, does that actually compensate? And I say, no, it doesn't. So there's the footprint of Maules Creek, around there, the yellow. This this sort of gives you a bit of an understanding of the lay of the land of the forest. You can see there's sort of that ridge, the horseshoe ridge, like it's sort of a natural amphitheatre basin in there. So that's the southern catchment, and then north of that ridge you've got the sort of the northeast aspect that runs off that. Yeah, and when I talked about the noise and light, it's that natural sort of amphitheatre effect that sort of traps it within that area. So yeah, the original offsets were found not to be adequate, and I think that finding was largely due to the fact that we'd been jumping up and down and saying all along that it wasn't adequate, but the independent review did find this. What we found, that it wasn't adequate and they needed to purchase more properties. Probably of most interest in this slide is these properties, Mirrodale and Mount Lindsay, they actually occur up there alongside Capitar National Park. So their elevations are sort of 850 metres up to 1,000 metres. And those were the properties that we've been saying right since the earliest days. You cannot be using them as offsets because it's in a different bioregion, it's got different climate, it's got different vegetation, it's got different species assemblages in general, and yet they made up the bulk of the offset area, 5,813 hectares. So of what they had at that time, so this is 2013, we've got more now in the next slide to show you. So yeah, those two properties made up the bulk of it, and yet they were so wrong. So this shows you the layout of the offset properties at present. So this is the latest one, Wangala. This is Mount Lindsay, this is Wirradale. These are the new offsets here, that's Onaville, Oakleigh. And down here we've got Roseglass and Bimboria. And all those other blue areas are the other offsets that were original ones. So yeah, with the current situation, we've now got 12,917 hectares of offsets. It's what's actually in those hectares and what actual habitat value and what the vegetation communities are on those areas. And it's a condition, the requirement of the EPBC Act says that offsets must be like for like. And the actual approval condition of this mine was based that it had to be better, it had to be equal to or better habitat quality than the forest. And we've proven that's not the case.
Bill, just want to say one thing. Another concerning fact, I suppose, is that that's a lot of land in overseas ownership.
Yeah, that too.
And also all the other mines that are going to be in the area. That difference.
That's right. And it also demonstrates how hard it is to actually find like for like. So they're forced to buy more and more properties that trying to get this area requirement. But it just doesn't exist. What we have in Leard State Forest just doesn't exist. So the areas that they're buying are either way up there on top of the range or they're the really rocky ridges down here on the edge of the slopes. So we're saying that it's still exaggerated. Even though that has had the tick of approval, we're saying that those numbers still aren't adequate. So all those blue areas there are all the offsets around the north of the forest. So they're all largely ex-cultivation properties, grazing properties that have been cleared over time, and they're proposing that they'll manage those to regenerate.
Are they going to paint white box on them?
Some areas they are. Yep. Yeah, we'll get on to that in a minute. So this is a map showing areas that we've assessed. These are the properties up alongside Capitar. These are some of Bogabro's offset here, and this is Maules Creek offsets here and here. And that's the area just north of the forest. So here's the forest here. The Maules Creek mine's going to sit in there like that. So this is some of those properties adjoining that we assessed. So yeah, the big issue is that it's a huge lot of land that they've purchased for these offsets, but it's going to take up to 100 years to actually regenerate anything like the same habitat that we see in the forest. That's a map of those two northern properties that I was showing you alongside Capitar, Mount Lindsay and Wirradale. That shows the extent of what they claimed was white box critically endangered ecological community that we disputed. And there's a more recent map of that same area where they've changed the vegetation mapping. Again, some of that area, it's not just the critically endangered ecological community that we're disputing the whole vegetation mapping that was done by someone who didn't know what they were looking at. And that's the most recent mapping of the same area. They've changed it again in further trying to refine it. We're saying that it's still exaggerated the extent of the critically endangered ecological community. So they're the areas on those properties that were mapped as critically endangered ecological community that we targeted. So we put sites in there in January 2013. We went back again in August 2013 with a different consultant. Went back again in January with another consultant. And that's the combination of those sites that were checked in those 3 occasions. And then that's where we are right now. The most recent assessment of that area, that's the area that we've covered. There's been 3 consultants up there now done independent reviews. So within that green area, this is Wongala over here, within that green area, which is Mount Lindsay and Wirradale, of 1,900 hectares that we've looked at there, we reckon there's only about 100 hectares that fits the description, the proper description of the critically endangered ecological community. So this is what it looks like on the ground. So here we've got Western New England blackbutt, Eucalyptus andrewsii, and a little layer of low shrubs. So it's nothing like the white box woodland. So yeah, we found John Hunter, Dr. John Hunter, the botanist from Armidale. He came up with a finding that was 95% wrong, and at most there'd only be 2 to 5% of that area that is actually critically endangered ecological community. So there's the comparison. This is what the offsets are. This is the box woodland of the forest. So it's not only our word that's saying it's wrong, this is actually out of the consultant's report, where it identifies all these communities in yellow here. This column down here is what occurs in the forest, this column here is what occurs in the offsets. So these communities here just don't occur in the forest whatsoever. So this one here, white box stringbutt, grassy woodland, doesn't occur in the forest, and yet we've got 1,389 hectares of it conserved, and that's supposed to be an offset for something that doesn't even occur in the forest. So these are the issues that science has just been twisted in every respect. This is the Wongala property, the most recent one that they purchased. It's supposed to be all critically endangered ecological community. Those red dots there are locations where it is not the community. That's a photo of that shot. That's apple box. It's a common eucalypt that occurs at high elevation. It looks like white box, but it's not. It's actually different. It's Eucalyptus bridgesiana. And this is that Untitled property just north of the forest here. So this is the forest. That entire area was mapped as critically endangered ecological community. When I went over it, there was only this tiny little red bit around the edge. This is what we're seeing time and time again, where they're claiming much larger areas because the whole approval was based on hectares of the critically endangered ecological community. They've just inflated it. It's a case of cooking the books. So that's the same area, Armidale. That's supposed to be a white box woodland. Not a white box in sight. It's all narrow leaf iron bark and white cypress. This is the offset properties down on the Kelvin Range, Vimboria and Roseglass. As you can see, they're incredibly hard rocky ridges. This is the problem, that there weren't good areas of offsets available. The areas of offsets that were available were really rough goat country, really hard ridges that didn't have anything like the same threatened species habitat potential as the forest. So for this particular property, we're looking at 1,160 hectares of good habitat for threatened species. That's how it's been sold in the reports. So this area here, 1,160 hectares of good threatened species habitat. That is not the case. Anyone that knows that landscape knows that white cypress pine, narrow-leaf ironbark community has very low value. And this is typical of the problem over a lot of the offsets, with a lot of very thick white cypress regeneration on it. And that is going to cost a fortune to try and manage to ever get it back to anything like a woodland form. Most recently, there was the Natural Resource Commission did an assessment of the white cypress forests out here around Boggabri, and they came up with a figure of between $350 per hectare to $550 per hectare to thin white cypress over a 7-year period to manage those forests to control cypress. Well, we're talking about up to 100 years is going to be required for these areas to get them back to woodlands. So you can imagine the amount of money that it's going to cost to try and get a woodland back into that landscape. Without fire, it's just going to keep doing the same thing. It's going to come back time and time and time again. The other big issue is tropical grasses and weeds in general that are invading the offset properties. This is an Onova. It's one of those tropical grass mixes where you've got tall Rhodes grass and a whole bunch of other grasses that are very capable of invading into woodlands. And on the roads just near there, there's green panic, and there's also buffel grass, which are renowned for invading into woodlands. This is a property just west of the forest. So here's the forest here. There's a property just west of the forest called Kelso. And in the impact assessment, they claim that it has 342 hectares of high condition remnant for threatened species. When we actually looked at it, there's only 263 hectares of it, and it's very poor. It's not high condition remnant at all. That's it there. So it's largely the same story, very thick white cypress on rocky ridge remnants of low conservation value, of low value to threatened species. And of note there is the extent of the trees that are dying. I don't know if you've been looking around these last 2 years, but a lot of the ridges around Boggabri have had extensive tree and shrub death with the 2 heat wave events we've had in January. January last year broke all existing records. The January this year broke all existing records again. So if that's not a sign of climate change, what it is. East of the forest, this is a property in Mallee, another one of the offset properties. That's the forest there. They're proposing a corridor to link that to that. Same story, it's all very simplistic. These are really nice ideas, don't get me wrong. These are really great ideas. If we were doing a landscape conservation plan without a mine blowing away a huge section of forest, this would be very easy to sell as a great thing to do. But the problem is, with all these measures, is that the time lag, it's just not going to deliver in the time necessary for the forest. That shows some of the corridor plans that are proposed to link those areas up. All really good ideas. That's a close-up of that particular area that they're planning as a corridor. You can see the scalded soil and the bare nature of the ground from years of cultivation and grazing. So it's that time lag that's crucial to all the fauna. So it's the high-dependent fauna in particular. So we're looking at all the bats and possums and gliders and those species. They're not going to find any of these regenerated areas of suitable habitat for a very, very long time. Meanwhile, the forest is cleared. So yeah, that's on the ground, looking at that particular area where they're proposing to put the corridor from there to the forest, which is just behind me. That's the landscape, and part of the plan is that it's supposedly going to recreate the woodland loss, the white box woodland. This is the Boggabri mine regeneration area. This is typical of a lot of it, virtually the lot of it actually. It's already invaded with tall Rhodes grass, and that's going to be permanent. I don't see how they're going to try and claw that back now. And yet these areas are supposed to be regenerating the diversity of plants that occur in the forest. Yeah, so that's the same story. It's supposed to be regenerating the same diversity of plants. There's no way in the world that is going to happen. This is an area of tree death where the Blockade pit was discharged water through the forest. So yeah, the big picture is for a lot of the threatened species, the offsets aren't going to provide the same quality habitat. So a lot of those ridge remnants are not going to provide the nectar source for these particular 2 species, the region honeyeater and swift parrot. And the Talbot linearis, that little plant that we found, it still hasn't been considered or offset whatsoever. It was found in the Maules Creek area there, and that's where they hired a consultant to say that it didn't occur. And we had to live with that in the court case, because it was only my word against his. We've now found it extensively through this area around the Blockade pit, and yet it still hasn't been considered. There's another threatened plant in the forest, Leard State Forest. So this is the white box woodland. The significance of it is that there's 0.05% left in original condition. So what we're seeing now, the Senate inquiry that most recently made recommendations just in the last few weeks has come out and said now recommended to the government that in future any critically endangered ecological community should be excluded from impact. So that's probably one of our greatest achievements to this point in time, is that we were able to provide a lot of information to that Senate inquiry. And we've seen in the recommendations that have come out of that Senate inquiry, they have adopted a lot of what we've been saying. But we've still got to get Tony Abbott to actually take it up and actually implement it. So this is called the long-eared bat. It's a nationally and state listed bat that lives in the forest, dependent on tree hollows. All those high elevation offsets that I just showed you up the onside Caputar, they are not suitable habitat for it, and yet it's been considered by both state and federal governments that that is adequate, suitable habitat. I happen to know this bat really well, as good as anyone, and it won't occur up there. This is the koala that has a lower occurrence in the forest, but it is there. So stringy bark and ironbark and cypress communities in the offsets are poor quality habitat for the koala. This is the pale-headed snake that we recorded in the forest, and since then there's been another record. It hasn't been considered whatsoever. The whole impact assessment process has largely ignored it. Squirrel glider, same story, it wasn't recorded until we recorded it within the forest. It has been considered, but it's going to be impacted by all those other additional effects that we talked about, of the noise and light for 24/7, and it will likely decline. It's a hollow-dependent species, and those box woodlands with over 100 hollows per hectare, that's the sort of habitat that it likes. And that quality of habitat won't regenerate in the offsets within the life of the mine to provide equivalent habitat. This is the large-eared pied bat. That's one of the cave-dependent species that I referred to, and it has not been adequately considered. This is the barking owl. It's a large owl that occurs in the forest, and it's pretty much dependent on woodlands. The fragmentation of the forest, as you saw from that first photo, with the mines dividing the forest in two, it's more than likely going to leave the forest due to fragmentation and the noise and light throughout the forest. Turquoise parrot is one of the more significant species of the forest. It's really the home of them. There's a lot of them up there. It's going to decline because it needs those mature box woodlands and tree hollows that you don't find in the offsets. Grey crown barbel, same story, it'll decline as the majority of the offsets are unsuitable habitat. Yellow-bellied sheath-tailed bat, same story, it needs lots of hollows and woodlands, and it'll likely decline. The same story for little pied bat, it's another hollow-dependent species that will decline. So yeah, we've heard about economics justifying the destruction of Leard State Forest. In that first video, it sort of went through some of the issues and explained how the economics don't stack up. I'll just whiz through very quickly. So we've been sold that there's going to be 340 direct construction jobs and another 470 permanent positions. And yet, in this last year gone, we saw a tapering of the lowering of the coal price, and there was 140 workers laid off. So, yeah, it would seem from that job security is quite low. Most of the workers are fly in, fly out, not locals. Local businesses have lost long-term skilled employees. and they can't afford to pay the mines wages to compete against them, and they've been forced to increase wages and charge rural customers more. I had this discussion with one of the major farm machinery companies that has businesses in all these major towns of the catchment. Long-term residents driven away by rent increases, and the use of mines donated to the public is a real issue. They seem to be buying approval right throughout by giving money to all sorts of different causes and community sporting bodies, etc.
Phil?
Yep.
Including the actual council, say the Narrabri Council,
Yep.
with the voluntary payment agreements. They get a cent per tonne. I think 6 or 8 cents. Does anyone know the exact figure per tonne? That 1 per week's production.
Yeah.
That goes directly into the Narrabri Council.
Yeah, it's good to see them contributing, but it's just the way it's done. You know, I can't help but think it's buying approval. This is the big picture that we saw in that original video, where mine is actually only 2% of the workforce. Most of it's in all the other areas: tourism, agriculture, education and manufacturing. And that's impacted mines, the Aussie dollar value, which you saw Mark mentioned before. It's impacted on machinery, tourism, agriculture and education. As mining's gone up, the diversified economy's come down, so we've been losing manufacturing industry. And as far as agricultural exports, that's where they'd be if it wasn't for the high dollar value. Australian farmers would be getting a lot more out of it. And for a lot of people, they're really upset about the taxation subsidies given to mining in general. So 2012 was 4 billion. In 2013 there's 4.5 billion. And it just makes you question with company tax revenues falling, and it makes you wonder who's actually controlling the country. That's the budget of handouts, the federal money that's handed out to mines. So it's overwhelmingly foreign owned, 83%. Those little black bits at the top are Australian. And John mentioned before about Kiribati over in the Pacific. 103,000 inhabitants of that island now being evacuated to Fiji. So this is the reality of climate change. They see it. And as John also said, the Nicholas Stern review, they came up with the finding that 80% of global coal reserves, including those in Australia, will need to remain in the ground to keep warming to less than 2 degrees C. Climate change will have a serious impact on food, human life and the environment. And probably worst of all, it's going to be the poorest countries that suffer the earliest and the most, even though they've contributed the least. The global costs of extreme weather, including flood and droughts, are already rising. And it's no longer possible to prevent climate change over the next 2 decades. So even if we were able to get it under control really quickly, we're still looking at 2 to 3 decades of continued change of the climate. But those worst impacts can be reduced if greenhouse gas levels can be stabilised between 450 and 550 parts per million of CO2. John also talked about the tipping point with West Antarctic ice sheet. It's sort of the biggest concern right now with increasing global temperatures. If it does go into meltdown, then there'll be a 3.3 metre sea level rise. So, as far as the current CO2 level, it's 488 parts per million, and it's rising at a level of 2 parts per million each year. You can achieve it. The costs of sustained action are low in comparison to the risks and costs of inaction. So if we act now, we're going to save ourselves a lot of money in the long run. The estimated annual cost of achieving that now is 2% of GDP, Whereas down the track, without action, it's going to cost 5% of GDP, and that could increase to 20%. So the Maules Valley is fast becoming the next Hunter Valley, as we saw before in the movie. There's currently 6 operating coal mines. There's 5 proposed, including Maules Creek, and that's going to impact very much on the whole community of the catchment. There's a view of the Hunter. We don't want it to end up like that. Now that Senate inquiry that I mentioned that we've contributed a lot to, they've come up with some really strong recommendations which will improve things, but we've yet to get the government to actually accept and want to implement these. So there's some really good measures there, like offsets should not be used as an excuse to allow developments in all circumstances. So that has been the problem till now. Offsets have been the saviour for inappropriate development, where for any development anywhere. They take the view that it can be offset. Well, if they're really serious about it, lots of impacts cannot be offset, and they're going to just have to say no. So that's some of the other recommendations that they came up with, which were really good. But yeah, like I said, remains to be seen whether or not they actually implement them. So in summary, the 3,400 hectares of the forest will be destroyed by the 2 mines. Of that, there's 1,167 of Box Gum Woodland, 28 species of decline. The impact of the forest has been underestimated, and it's going to leave the forest fragmented with 2 big holes in the ground. The water table will be lowered. It's going to affect farmers' water supply and vegetation of the remaining forest. The revegetation of the overburden will probably die as we've observed at the Ravensworth mine. Revegetation areas won't recreate the same critically endangered woodland that's been lost in the forest. Weeds will continue to invest in revegetation and conservation areas, and conservation agreements are not worth the paper they're written on. The offset properties don't provide the same like-for-like critically endangered ecological community found in the forest. Rocky Ridge remnants don't provide like-for-like habitat and won't enhance over time due to the thick cypress. The community will suffer from health and economic impacts. The world is moving away from dirty coal energy. Wind and solar are already comparable on non-level playing field, and it's only a matter of time when the economic bubble will burst and take down all those that are reliant on coal. As they say, you don't know what you've got till it's gone. The development and approval system is nothing more than a tokenistic tick box exercise. Nothing is sacred. Government influence and money can get anything approved using false and misleading information. Everyone but politicians know it's a no-brainer to destroy a forest that provides habitat for 30 threatened species and absorbs carbon. To get a coal mine that will emit 30 million tonnes of CO2 per year, provide a boom-bust economy and leave a huge hole in the ground that will pollute groundwater forever. Whichever way you look at it, there's no logic to this decision, and that is why people are protesting to stop this coal mine. And together we can make a difference, and that's what's happening on the ground daily, regularly. Some of the actions that's happened. So it was 229, more now. This old guy here, Bill, he's a legend. He's 92, 93 now, and he's an ex-Kokoda veteran. He's been arrested 4 times. And this is the most recent action that John's familiar with on the North Loop Road. And that's the beauty of this campaign. It's the diversity of people that are coming to it. We're getting everyone turning up. We've had doctors, we've had solicitors, we've had people from all walks of life wanting to come and show their opposition, which is fantastic. So refusing the Maules Creek mine should have been a no-brainer. The planning approval process has failed the people and the environment. With people power we can stop Whitehaven, Maules Creek mine and other new coal mines. Agriculture has a sustainable future, but coal is going the way of the dodo. I don't know how many of you saw that Four Corners program in the last two nights ago. It was really, really good. It really painted the picture very clearly how this has all been pushed on us, this supposed need for going more and more with coal and gas, when in actual fact it is not the right way to go. So don't underestimate the power of people, as we saw with Nelson. And unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. I really love that saying. Thanks for listening. Thank you.